What we want to do now is to try and bring together perhaps not everything that we've talked about, but most of the important features of object-oriented programming into a grand project. It's unfortunate now that I named it that because this doesn't solve the world's energy crisis, but it does bring together most of the elements of object-oriented programming that we've talked about. In that context, what we want to do is write the code as you should write it yourself. By that, I mean we go from the design and development process to actually implementing the code, debugging, and testing. The game that we're going to design is one I call in between. The basic idea is that two cards are shown on the table face up, and then you decide whether you want to bet whether the next card that's coming up falls between those two limits. For example, if you had the 3 of clubs and the Jack of hearts, you might want to bet that's a pretty good spread, and you might feel that the next card is going to fall between a 3 and a Jack. So you would place a bet. If it falls within those limits, in other words 4 to 10, you would win the bet. If you tie on either end, either the high or the low end, the dealer wins, much like in Las Vegas. And of course, if you're below or above the 2 limit cards, then you lose. Now, this is one of those situations where I actually have a user interface in mind before I even started the project. Now, I did not construct the user interface that you see on the screen right now. What I did was I just took a piece of paper and a pencil, and I kind of sketched what you see on the screen. And you'll see at the top the balance. Actually, you're given $100 to start with. The reset button on the extreme right resets that to $100 and a default wager of $10. When you click on the Deal button, a new set of cards appear in the low and the high text boxes that you see. And right now you're seeing an Ace of Hearts and the 8 of Hearts. And whoever was playing this game thought that that was a reasonable bet, so they clicked on the Bet button. And if you look up on the screen, you'll see towards the right side of the screen, but within the group box called Hand, you'll see a QC, which is the Queen of Clubs. And since that's higher than the 8 of Hearts, that's outside the limit, so they would lose the bet. And I print a message below the Bet button saying, sorry, you lose. And the $10 wager was subtracted from the balance, and it's ready for the next $10 wager. If you don't like the particular cards pairings that you see, like if you got a 3 of Hearts and a 5 of Clubs, that probably is not a good bet, so you would just hit the Deal button again, and that would refresh those 2 card lists for the high and low. And you keep doing this until you want to quit or until you're broke. When you're broke, the game is over. This user interface design was done, like I said, on paper because I kind of knew in my mind what I wanted it to look like. You will have a temptation to start dragging and dropping. This is the biggest mistake that my students make in class. I will give an in-class programming assignment. They will sit down and they will immediately start dragging and dropping objects on a form. And they do that because they think that movement means that they're working towards a solution. And that's not necessarily so. In most cases, they're going to have to start over. And it's kind of fun to stand in front of 35 students and watch all but 1 or 2 of them instantly start dragging and dropping stuff onto a form. But you'll see 1 or 2 students who just kind of lean back in their chairs and stare at the ceiling for a minute, and then they'll scribble a little bit of stuff down on a piece of paper, and then they'll start actually building the design for the program, and inevitably they're the first ones done, and they have a better functioning program than the people who just start out willy-nilly with no design. So get used to the fact that you need to have a design, and it has to be somewhat formal. In this case, my first design step was a hand sketch of what I wanted the user interface to look like. That works sometimes, but it doesn't always work. However, the front end is important, And stakeholders in the program, if it's not just something for your own personal use, you probably want to get feedback from the stakeholders who will be running the program. If you'll recall an earlier slide that we talked about, the old style of big design up front, the BDUF approach to something where you spend 3 or 4 months designing it and you show it to the stakeholder, and after 2 minutes that whole design effort goes out the window. So instead, what you should do is the agile modeling approach, where you show something, they get feedback from what the user says, you go back, you do it again, and it's an iterative process that doesn't have a lot of investment up front. My investment here was a hand sketch that took maybe 2 minutes to do. The first thing that we want to do, if we are going to drive this from the user's point of view, and most games are driven from the user's point of view, we can use our 5 programming steps as a good starting point in designing this piece of software. So the first step, step 1, is the initialization step. For this particular program, that means setting up the form. In other words, Windows is going to build in the background all of the objects that you've dragged onto the form. It's going to put them in their proper place, and it's going to build that memory image that ultimately is going to be shown to the user. That's something that you build as you're developing the program, but it ends up being run as part of the initialization step. The next thing that you wanted to do is establish the initial betting amount. I chose $100. You can set that to whatever you want, and I established the initial bet as being $10. Obviously, that's not etched in stone. It could be whatever you wish it to be. But the important thing is that's done prior to the form being shown on the screen. The same is true for the initial bet. And the next thing I do is shuffle the deck of cards. Now, obviously, this is not a physical deck of cards. It's a deck of cards that comes from a class that we're going to let manage everything that has to do with cards. So right away, since I'm playing a game that requires cards, I have an object called a deck of cards that I know I'm going to have to write code for. So in the back of my mind, in this initialization step, I know I have to have a class object that represents a deck of cards. The input step. If you'll recall our discussion of the 5 programming steps, the second step is the input step. One of the things that we allow in this program is we allow them to change the wager. For example, if it comes up, if the 2 cards, the low card is the ace of something and the high card is the king of something, chances are that's a pretty good bet, and they might want to make it a lot bigger bet than $10. So we have to have the amount of the wager to be changeable by the user who's running the program. Then the next thing that the input step has to do is to deal the up cards. Those are the 2 cards that appeared in those text boxes towards the bottom of the display. That has to be the responsibility of the input step, because that is information that the user has to use to input what their decision is. Then we have to get a bet or a deal click event. What we're saying here is that if they want to bet, we're assuming that those first 2 conditions are set up. They've got the correct betting amount that they want to wager, and they've looked at the up cards when they made that wager. And now they're saying that's a good deal, so they're going to click on the bet button, and that means that they have accepted what they see in the text boxes, and they think the next card is going to fall between those limits, and they're willing to risk that amount of money as a wager on that set of input data. The deal button means I don't like the cards that I currently am seeing, so put another set of cards up. In other words, they're going to throw away the 2 cards that are in the high-low text boxes, and they're going to redeal, if you will, the next 2. Another part in the input step is to make sure that the rules of the game are followed. And by that, one of them is, do they have any money left? Because if they don't, the game is over. So that's one of the rules that has to be enforced. The other one is, when you look at those upper and lower limit cards, clearly one of the rules is ties go to the house. If you're within the range, the player wins. Anything outside of those limits, the house wins that too. So we have to have something that is going to enforce the rules of the game as we currently understand those rules. That to me means that we need sort of a rules class that's going to administer this game. Another advantage of taking that approach is if we write a card deck class and then we want to change the game in some fashion, we already have a good chunk of the work done because we now have a class that can shuffle a deck of cards and perhaps deal out one card at a time or whatever we decide. The third step in the 5 steps is the process step. Part of the process is to compare the high and low cards to the target card. In other words, does the card that was just turned up, does it fit between the high and the low cards so that we have a winner? Or does it equal one of the high or low cards, in which case the house wins? Or does it fall outside of the high-low limits, in which case the house wins also? If we have a win, then the process step has to add the amount of the wager back into their balance, or what I call the betting pool. That's the pool of cash that the player has to continue playing the game. If they lose, then we have to be able to have rules that said subtract the amount of the wager from the betting pool, and we should probably also check then at that point to see if the game ends, because if they're broke, by definition, that's the end of the game. If they are broke, then, well, the game ends. If they win, we should probably give them some feedback to show that we've adjusted their balances. And that was that little message below the bet button, and it says you win. And if you lose, then the message is changed and it says you lose. So we give them some kind of a visual feedback that we've processed the bet, we've adjusted the betting totals, and we're ready to play the next set. The display step is the 4th step. We want to show the card positions on the screen. And if you'll notice, I had that, I think it was the Queen of Clubs, shown outside of the 2 cards that were in the limit. This just gives a visual feedback to the point that the Queen was higher than the 8 of Hearts or whatever it was on the screen. And so we put it to the upper right. If it falls between the 2 card limits, then we position it in the middle. And if it falls below, we position it to the extreme left side of the display screen. That actually is more complicated to do than you might suspect, but it's a nice visual feedback as to what's going on. So we do that in the display step. We also have to display the win or lose message. And then we have to update the betting pool. And then, of course, we have to check to make sure that we have enough money in the betting pool to continue. And we may or may not want to reset the default betting amount to $10. For example, if you got a really good card spread and it was, again, let's say the ace and the king, and you increase the bet to $50 and you make the bet, you might want to, after the end of that play, reset the bet back to $10 so they don't automatically bet $50 on the next bet. The termination step is the final step in the project, and that is concerned with cleaning up the resources that you've used in this particular program. If you would go back and look at the initialization step for this program, you will see that there are no resources that are not controlled by the Windows Memory Manager here. We're not opening any database connections. We're not opening any network connections or any special files. So the termination step is going to be pretty simple in our case. All we need to do really is to process the exit click event, which is just a simple call to a close method. And now we're ready to start thinking about how we want to design the rest of this grand project. Even though we're actually still in the design phase, for educational reasons, I'm going to show you what the program looks like while it's actually running. And I think that will help you to understand what's going on in the design stage. Obviously, when you're designing a piece of software, you have an idea in your mind of how it works. And perhaps by me just kind of talking and telling you what's supposed to be happening, that's not the same as seeing the program run. So I'm just going to take a quick moment here to show you what the final program actually looks like, and we'll go from there. So here's the program as it's running. And here, this is the betting, what I call the betting pool, and it starts out with an initial amount of $100. And then each wager is set in this particular one. You'll notice the betting pool amount is grayed out, which means that this is a read-only text box. We don't want to give the user the ability to just go in and give themselves $1 million. So we're going to stake them for 100, and that's all they can do. The wager, though, you'll notice can take input. You can change the amount of the wager to whatever you want. You change it to $50, for example. Or you can do a reset. That would set both of these numbers back to 100 and to 10. The deal button then is responsible for calling the card deck to put 2 cards in these 2 windows. So each time you hit the deal button, you're going to get 2 cards appearing. And they will always appear with the lower one on the left in the low window and the upper card in the right window. We manage that in part of the process steps to pick the lower and the upper of the 2 sets and then decide. Now you look at those and you decide whether you want to make a bet or not. Well, there's not much room between the 9 and the jack, so I probably would not place a bet, and I would hit the deal button again. Now the 3 of hearts and a jack is a pretty good spread, so I'd probably go pretty risky on that. And I would wage quite a bit, and I'd hit bet. And I got a 4, which falls between the 3 and the jack, so I win, and you'll notice we've automatically updated our winning balance to $150. And I have not implemented the code that changes this back, so if I want the next bet to be something other than $50, I do have to change it. This is a feature that you can add to the game later. Deal. 2 and the queen, I'd bet the farm. We're going to go $100 on that. And I win. I think maybe I'll leave today and go to Vegas. I'm on a roll. And 6 and 7, that's probably not a good bet. 6 and 10, still not good. 2 and 8, not real happy with. 3 and 6, not happy. 10 and king, not happy. Not happy. Still not happy. Still not happy. Oh. I'm all in. Okay? Now, a game suggestion has been made where there should probably be an ante for each bet. And now that I think about it, that's probably a good idea, but unfortunately, this is etched in granite at this point, so that will be a feature that the guy that had the idea is going to add to the game at some other time. But anyway, I think you've got the idea of what is going on, how the game works, and I think that seeing it run will help you understand the code that we're going to go through. By the way, in the background, you can see how I've used those region features that Microsoft gives to you to isolate the initialization step, the input step, and by the way, if you do leave the cursor on it long enough, you get some of the code showing that's hidden because of the region thing. Process, display, and termination.